I argue there's two things going on. I think there's a cultural problem, which I've kind of already discussed in terms of the reasons why we're seeing this explosion of need and this labelling.
Yeah.
Kind of a contagion effect.
Yes.
Where children are encouraged to kind of take on these identities. But at the same time, parents have stepped back and have, not just parents, adults in general have stepped back and not used their authority to provide children with direction.
Welcome to Care Vision's Family Talk, a space dedicated to exploring the challenges of raising children in today's world. I'm Lucy Johnston. Each episode, I chat with a guest and we dive into the real-life struggles faced by children and their carers, offering insights and practical guidance to help families feel understood, supported, and hopeful. Whether you're a parent, foster carer, grandparent, or anyone supporting the young people in your life, this is the place for you. Today we're asking one of the biggest questions in childhood. Why are so many children struggling? 1 in 5 children is now identified as having a special educational need, and that's a 40% increase on the last decade. So what's going on? Are we recognising children who were previously overlooked, or why are we increasingly turning ordinary childhood difficulties into medical conditions? I'm delighted to welcome my guest today, Dave Clements. He's author of Crisis in the Classroom, which I have right here. He's a former school governor and he's father of a son with autism and ADHD. Dave, thank you so much for joining us.
So, Lucy, for inviting me.
So we'll just start with the question at the heart of your book. 1 in 5 children now has a special educational need. If 1 in 5 children has special needs, are they still special?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I talk about that quite a lot in the book. I grapple with this difficulty that we seem to have with making distinctions between children who are, in inverted commas, normal and those who have a problem of some sort. And I think that expresses itself in different ways. And a lot of the language we use around this topic is very slippery and very difficult to pin down. So special educational needs, they can mean all sorts of things. Different schools will assess children as being worthy of being described as having a special educational need, whereas others won't. It's very subjective. And the same can be said for some of the conditions that children are diagnosed with, particularly ADHD and even autism. Autism is quite an established diagnosis, but over the years and over the decades, it has broadened out and it is much more inclusive, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can be reasonable to do that because children with Asperger's have autism. They're more able, but they still have problems. So, you know, it's not a cut and dry issue, but I think the problem we have at the moment is that we're very bad at making those kinds of distinctions.
Do you believe that more children are, in fact, struggling and have needs and that's grown? Or do you think we're just describing childhood differently? Again,
it's not straightforward. As you said, I'm a father of a boy who has both ADHD, or rather I should say he was diagnosed with ADHD because it's still uncertain what ADHD is, and he's also diagnosed with autism. So, you know, it's difficult to kind of establish how you pin down what's going on with these children. And I think we're probably talking about different groups of children. I think there's a large group of children who are still not getting the support they require and who may not have a diagnosis, they may be waiting for a diagnosis. And they're really struggling. And then there are other children who are the larger group who are being diagnosed with conditions, but it isn't necessarily helping them. And I think what we tend to do is we tend to look for labels. We want to explain away children's problems by medicalising them. And I don't think that's helpful for most children. I think for most children, there are likely to be other explanations. And because we have these slippery terms, it's difficult to kind of establish what that is. I think a lot of the time we might be talking about behaviour issues that children have, and there'll be social and cultural reasons for those behaviour issues. But those children may well be diagnosed with ADHD. So even whether or not you have the diagnosis, it doesn't necessarily help that child because the system is so overwhelmed. There's very little support out there. So yeah, I think problems have got worse for children. And I talk about in the book about a variety of problems that are going on in classrooms, from behaviour problems to anxiety issues, to attendance and exclusions, and all of these things are happening at the same time. So that's getting worse. But how we understand it is getting more complicated. I think we're getting confused as a society about how to understand those different problems.
Yeah. So do you think children are being medicalised when they didn't need to be? That's not to say that there aren't children with genuine needs, and that sometimes naughty becomes a need, or, children are struggling but they're diagnosed with an illness but they don't need to be given a label. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. And I think sometimes we can be a bit cynical. We can think, there are people pretending that their children have these conditions or pretending that they have these conditions. But I think it is just... it's an easier way of explaining something if you can just give it a name and then somebody sorts it out for you. If there's an expert out there who can hopefully solve the problem that your child's experiencing, and sometimes that's possible, but in many cases I don't think it is. And I think we end up with the label, but we don't really address the underlying issues. So yeah, I think we need to kind of get better at making those fine judgments about the nature of the problems that these children are experiencing.
We don't know really whether what we're doing and the amount of money that we're spending with councils and local authorities are being bankrupted by the amount they're spending, and schools are struggling to keep up. What is cost effective? Do you think that we need some kind of something to oversee what we're doing and how we're looking after these children, or how we're giving them the best education? Do you think we've just kind of, it's run away with itself?
Yeah, I think there are lots of perverse incentives in the special educational needs system. And I don't think it's necessarily anybody's fault. I think it's just grown over the past, it's only over the past 10 years, really, that we've had this particular system in place. And I think the money becomes very important. And not in a cynical way, but I think schools and parents alike are chasing resources. And sometimes those resources come with defining children with a set of needs. So if a child who's struggling in class is understood to have a special educational need, if those needs are clear enough to qualify them for an education health and care plan, an EHCP, which is supposed to be for more complex needs. Yeah. But if a child qualifies for that, there's some more money that comes with that. And if you've got 4 or 5 children whose needs are complex enough or severe enough, you may well be able to afford a teaching assistant. So I think schools who are sometimes, pretty hard up and struggling in terms of resources, they'll go for that. That's a solution to some extent. It gives them an extra person in the class to try and deal with a classroom that might be quite difficult and quite disorderly. So I think that's what schools do. And I think parents, likewise, they see that there aren't the resources there in the classroom and their child's struggling. And so they go along with that process because they think it might help them. But in the end, it doesn't necessarily help at the macro level because we can't afford it. And local authorities can't afford it. And as a society, we can't afford it.
And there may be children getting the extra help at the expense of others who really do need it, do you think?
Well, yes. And I think sometimes we perhaps misunderstand what's going on there. I think what's often happening is it's not that these problems are being made up, but what's happening is that the bulk of children who are going through this process and families, they're crowding out the resources that are available. And so you get these huge waiting lists for both for special educational needs assessments and also for diagnoses for conditions like ADHD and autism. And, on those lists, you'll have children who do need that support. But, there's no way of knowing in advance which one's which. And so inevitably you get both situations happening at the same time. You get lots of what you might describe as false positives, but then you also get a lot of kids who are left behind and really struggling. There are lots of children with special educational needs who are stuck at home, who don't have a school at all, or they're on a part-time timetable. And there are other kids who are in school and they're creating all sorts of problems because their needs aren't being met. So I think it's a bit of both. We've got a problem of the system being overwhelmed by questionable needs, or perhaps needs that have been wrongly understood. And then you've got genuine, really difficult needs that need to be addressed.
You mentioned that the system was really only started 10 years ago, but what system are we talking about? And the perverse incentives, I don't know whether you can put a number on it, but would you be able to even say what those incentives have led to in contributing to the rise in labelling?
In terms of numbers, the special educational needs system in England, I had the figures for, so it's 1.7 million, I think it was, children in England with special educational needs. That's probably gone up recently. It's probably more than that by now.
I think it's 1.8. I read today.
1.8.
Yeah.
The trouble with the figures in this area that they do keep going up. So every time you hear a figure, it's usually out of date. For EHCPs, the education, health and care plans I spoke about, there are over 500,000, I believe it is, children on those plans in England.
Is that what's set up? You said the system changed 10 years ago. Is that what was introduced, these special plans that children have in school? That's right. So before that, what was going on? Children didn't have special help, care plans. There wasn't these perverse incentives. Is that right? Have we seen a correlation between this special support and the rise in diagnosis?
It was a different system. It was called statementing, child with special educational needs statements. I think what's happened is that there's been a shift to kind of an approach to special educational needs that's very much focused on the rights of parents to have certain provision, to have their preferred school. And it's driven very much by a kind of legal. And even now you'll see that the debate about this issue is very much driven by this demand that parents retain their rights. And there's a lot of lawyers in the system. And I can understand why some parents will want to hold on to those things. They want to hold on to their plans. They want to hold on to their entitlements. But I think it's driven this kind of entitlement culture, which I don't think is necessarily helpful. I think it'd be much more helpful to focus on provision that meets need, rather than encouraging this kind of claims making. I think that's what's happening at the moment. There's this kind of individualized process whereby everybody's kind of just trying to get their bit of resource, their provision for their child, and the school's doing the same thing. And local authorities are kind of just struggling. Most parents will have a terrible experience of their local authority because it's just broken. The system is very difficult, and you'll wait for a very long time to be contacted before you even get close to getting the provision you need. But at the same time, they're just overwhelmed by all these claims. So
how do you know, what evidence do you have that we are potentially overdiagnosing some children, giving them labels when actually they are displaying normal childhood behaviours? How can we know this? What are the definitions of autism and ADHD?
Well, I can't give you it word for word because it does keep changing. Those definitions have changed over time. It's very difficult to kind of tie it down. But what I would say is I'd never use the term overdiagnosis myself. There are people who make those arguments, and I'm sympathetic to them. But I don't think it is necessarily a problem of overdiagnosis. You'll also hear people argue the opposite, particularly clinicians, and they will say there's underdiagnosis, which I think is also quite probably true in certain circumstances. Like you'll hear about girls with autism who are only now being diagnosed. You hear about girls with Tourette's syndrome who haven't been diagnosed before. And that's to do with the criteria that are used. They tend to kind of be quite biased, and they tend to favour the way boys present. So I think, there is an argument there that there's some underdiagnosis in the system, but there's certainly what I describe as an explosion of needs in the system. Okay. And I think that's driven by culture, not by diagnosis as such. It's driven by people over-labelling.
Okay, so we're not saying that there isn't an explosion of needs, but what we're looking at is the labels, and there are many. I don't know whether you can go through some of them. We have attention deficit disorder, various spectrum disorders, various neurodiversities. So you're saying that not all of these children should or need to be labelled. Who decides, and how do they decide when a child gets a label? And how unhelpful is an inappropriate label?
Labels will be attached, and their value, I think, is very much down to their ability to attract resources. And the more people with those labels, the less resources that are available. I just think it's a problem of misattributing problems that children may be experiencing. So what I try not to do is I don't like to dismiss some of the issues that children and families face. And I feel there's a tendency to do that sometimes. Yeah. And I think often there's a real need. So kids with ADHD, they may well have genuine problems around organisation, around sitting still in class, around concentration. Yeah. Distinguishing those problems from other children isn't so straightforward. So whether it's appropriate or not is hard to say, but different clinicians will come up with different answers to that question. But a lot of these diagnoses are very subjective, and like any mental health diagnosis, it's often not reducible to an objectively determined cause or a biological cause. So there's always an element of fuzziness with these categories, and I think there's also a lot of interplay between clinicians and the culture of which they're a part. So they will tend perhaps to err on the side of being kind to a parent or a child if they think it might help them to have a diagnosis. And I quote somebody in the book who says they, as a therapist, have felt that pressure because they feel that they need to affirm effectively that looking for some sort of explanation, that looking for a label, because it can potentially bring some sort of resource, but it also brings an explanation. You'll often hear people who've been diagnosed with ADHD or autism in particular, and particularly adults, who will say, oh, it explains so much. And I think sometimes that may be true, but I think often it's a way of perhaps misunderstanding their past. And it's easier to blame it on something which is external to them rather than owning whatever it is that goes on in their life.
So do you think diagnoses have become the sort of currency of the system, and we pushed parents into labels as a way of unlocking support when actually there's no need to label such children?
Yes, I think that happens. But interestingly, there's two things going on at the same time. You've got this increase in diagnoses, but at the same time, you've got this idea, which is very much pushed by people who talk about neurodiversity, that being different, having a different way of looking at the world, to be differently cognitively functioning is normal. And there are just different ways of living your life, of getting on with people, and we shouldn't be pathologizing that, which I think is a good way of describing it. I tend to agree with that, but what's happened though is that while people are saying, on the one hand, we should be accepting of neurodiversity, those labels aren't going away, and they're kind of multiplying, and they're happening at the same time as people are getting diagnoses. So they're not being treated as normal. They're being treated as a way of sometimes reorganizing institutions. So you'll find that in workplaces, in schools, they're increasingly being told by policymakers and by lobbyists and campaigners that they need to change the way they work. They need to change the way they operate. So the schools become completely different. They don't focus on passing on knowledge, on the teacher at the front of the class, teaching a body of students. It becomes much more about adapting their teaching to each individual child and each individual child's needs, which inevitably becomes very difficult. And it tends to undermine the educational experience for those children. So I think, on the one hand, we've got this explosion of diagnoses. On the other, we've got this kind of really corrosive ideology of neurodiversity, which is undermining schools and other institutions.
That's really interesting. So the corrosive ideology, which is undermining schools and other institutions, how does it undermine it? If we're all being inclusive and including all these people with all these labels, are you saying that then other things are being their children potentially are being shortchanged in other things? For example, what? Be more specific, can you?
Yeah, so I think what happens is that you've got this, there are a number of words that are used to describe this process. Like in education, you'll get two terms that are used a lot. One is inclusion. You'll hear Bridget Phillipson talk about inclusion by design. And then you've also got this notion of the whole school. And basically, those terms are used to describe a kind of, I say education, but it's not really education, to describe a kind of schooling, which is more about creating a community of children in a classroom than it is about teaching them. Yeah. It's more about bringing them together, regardless of their needs, regardless of their ability, than it is about trying to transmit knowledge and increase their learning. So I think what we've got at the moment is a very difficult situation that's been made worse by, if you look at the reforms that have been proposed for special educational needs in schools at the moment, it's very much about trying to, instead of dealing with the needs that children are presenting with and trying to find the right provision for them, it's more about trying to get all of those children into the same classrooms and then putting what they're calling inclusion bases, which are special schools within a mainstream school, effectively, in order, it seems, to save resources, because specialist provision is very expensive. It's usually independent provision, and also requires lots of transport to travel to those different special schools. So they're trying to reduce the spend on those schools. But it's also ideological. It's kind of putting this notion that all children should be in the same space above the learning experience of those children. And that impacts on both those children who have special educational needs or who might have autism or ADHD or other conditions, and also the other children. Both sets of children aren't getting their needs met. They're not. Yeah. They're effectively having a suboptimal education.
Yeah. Understood. I mean, do you think if support was available without diagnoses, would we see fewer autism and ADHD diagnoses?
I don't know. It's difficult. It's a counterfactual. I'm not sure I can answer that. But I certainly think if we got better at knowing where to draw the line, and that may be quite arbitrary, but if we were able to do that, we'd stand a better chance of putting the appropriate supports in place for different children. I think because we've got these very porous borders around these concepts, it just sucks more and more children in to no particular end. Because if you have a special educational need, it doesn't necessarily help you. It's just there might be some more resources, but it doesn't. You don't get to a point where you no longer have that where you no longer have that special educational need. Very few, you don't hear about children who, they're suddenly told, "Oh, now you're fine." What you have is a body of children who will always be known as having those needs. And in some cases, that may be appropriate if you do have a diagnosed condition, which is lifelong. But in many cases, we're talking about children who are falling behind or have a behavioural problem. And if you want to address those things, naming them doesn't necessarily help. You need to understand why those needs emerged in the first place. It may be to do with that child's upbringing. It may be to do with discipline in the family. It may be to do with the school itself. It may be that the school system isn't very good at socialising children and making them behave at school. So I think sometimes it's better to understand the problems in their own terms rather than just naming them. And then effectively farming them out for somebody else to deal with.
Yeah. Do you think the labels affect the children negatively? They then identify with this, I am this, I have this. It reduces their agency and their incentive to overcome some difficulties. Do you think there's or not for everyone, but a negative aspect to being labelled or defined as something?
Yes, I think that inevitably children are very impressionable and they will pick up on some of these terms. And it's happening quite a lot. Like we all hear about the kind of slightly unusual instances where, children who may adopt the identity of an animal, or there's the whole gender discussion.
Yeah.
Which is not unrelated to this discussion, because in all of these cases, it's children who are looking for some kind of identity, and the adults around them are affirming them in looking for identity. And it isn't necessarily something which is a good idea, particularly some more extreme examples.
Society has changed, that we have these children looking for an identity, adults affirming that. Do you think we need to be looking at the adults as well, and looking, instead of them looking for answers for their children, to look at themselves and the culture around the children and why children are increasingly defining themselves in different ways?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, but the thing is, adults are doing this as well. It's not just children. Adults are kind of identifying themselves with these different conditions, and encouraged to. And as I say, I don't dismiss that out of hand, but I think for the most part, it's not necessarily helpful. But yeah, there's certainly an absence there, I think, in the adult world, whereby children don't have a sense of direction. Adults tend to be less confident, I think, in raising children. We don't really have a clear sense of what the moral framework is, what the values we should be teaching them are. And there's less of a sense of community around adults. They don't look out for each other's children. So I think, generally speaking, that kind of context is quite a difficult one for children to be growing up in. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how there's a tendency to not talk about that. We don't talk about the problems in our communities, the difficulties that parents face, the breakdown of families. All of this stuff is happening, but we don't really talk about it. But it seems like a much better explanation to me for some of the problems that we're seeing with children, particularly around behaviour and particularly around mental health as well. So I think it would be helpful if we were able to talk about these other issues as well, if we're able to look at what's going on around us rather than trying to dive inside children's heads all the time.
Yeah. So being a child today, do you think children have changed?
Not really. I don't think children themselves have changed particularly. I think society's changed. I think we've put them in a very difficult situation. I think back in the 1990s, there was a big panic around strangers and around the dangers that the outside world poses. And I think ever since then, we've kind of withdrawn somewhat, both adults and children, and we've become very protective of them. And I think the use of devices, the use of social media, and there's obviously just been a social media ban, or there's a proposed ban. I think that hasn't helped, but I think what's happened is that there's been like a withdrawal into this kind of online world, and children have adopted that and taken to that because it's all that's open to them. They're told the world outside is a scary place and online feels safer, but now they're being told that the online world is a threat as well. So I think we've got a lot of problems, I think, which children are finding they're having to grow up amongst. We're not talking about them. And it's only when we start addressing these wider problems that we might be able to help them, I think, to have a clearer way of understanding themselves and have a more healthy development.
Do you think children are less free, less independent, more anxious? I mean, what do you think they've lost that previous generations had that may have contributed to this rise in behavioural problems or struggles?
I think their experience of the world is entirely different to ours. I see that in my own children, and they inevitably spend a lot more time at home, and because they're social animals like any other generation, they still seek each other out, so that they'll often use online platforms to seek each other out. And I think problematising that isn't necessarily a good thing. Like, there are dangers there, but I think it's natural that children seek each other out online and then they'll arrange to meet with each other. But they've got this much more constrained existence, I think, and everything's organised and regimented. So
do you think they don't have enough opportunities to sort of take risks, fail, solve problems for themselves? I think that's one of the reasons why they're struggling in life.
Yes, and again, it's an adult problem. It's something that we've ourselves balked at. We don't like the idea of risk. We don't like the idea of taking the calculated risks that we should be taking sometimes. Yeah, and I think children have picked up on that, or we've created an environment where those risks are no longer open to them. And I think children will perhaps seek them out. And I suppose the real difficulty is that there's a danger there that they're not ready to take risks then, so that when they do find themselves reaching that point of adulthood and potential independence, they're less prepared for it than previous generations, because previous generations were much better at preparing children for these different stages of life, and they were brought up with more adults around them, and not just virtually, but in person. They were part of a community of some sort, and their families tended to be much more present in their lives. So I think in the absence of those things, it makes it much more difficult for them to negotiate life now and in the future.
How much do you think of this is being driven by smartphones and social media? You mentioned it, but
I don't blame social media, and I know a lot of people do for some of these problems. I think I see it more as a symptom than a cause of the problems. I think children and adults too, to some extent, have become quite obsessed with this online world because we've withdrawn from the offline world effectively, and it may be that there's a relationship there between the use of technology and some of the issues that children face. There may be some sort of link there, but I don't think it's an explanation, really. I think I'd certainly say, though, the 1990s is an important period for a number of reasons, I think, but you will see that period is quite important in terms of the development of these labels and this notion that people function differently at a cognitive level. So that the idea of neurodiversity was born in the 1990s. And that's the same time that the internet emerged. And so people were finding each other online, young people who had difficulties socializing, difficulties getting on with each other, who may have been quite shy, not very socially able. They were able to meet each other online. So I do think there's a connection in as far as people who may be inadequate in one way or another, or lacking in their social skills, did meet online, and they've continued to do that, and a movement has been created around that. I think that's a big part of this explosion of need. But I wouldn't blame the technology itself. I think it's just a medium, after all.
Yeah. But the emergence of the neurodiversity and identifying as with diversity or some need, do you think that would be better had it not happened? I mean, it's a movement, isn't it? But is anything in what you're saying about this being actually unhelpful? We need to get behind it and understand the reasons for it and look at those rather than just label and put a prescription on.
Yeah, I'm quite critical of the idea of neurodiversity, but only because of what it's become. I think there was perhaps quite a positive kernel to it. Back in the 1990s, it was Judy Singer who came up with the term. She wrote about it in her undergraduate thesis, and it became quite famous subsequently because it kind of coined this term, which is, even she was writing about something that was already happening. And it wasn't entirely negative initially. I think there was something positive about this idea that young people who clearly had problems, not just young people, people in general, people who might have been described as geeks or nerds, they were struggling with life, and they found a way of communicating. They'd found a way of functioning better, of socializing, of creating a community around themselves. And they were self-supporting. They were able to help each other and gain a degree of self-understanding. They weren't looking for medications. They weren't looking for diagnoses, but they were describing themselves using these kinds of terms. So I don't think that was necessarily a bad thing. I think that was probably quite a good thing. But what that's become in our own age, several decades later, is something different. It's become institutionalized. It's become medicalized. And that's given it a certain legitimacy, and a broader legitimacy. And it's kind of accelerated this sense in which some very discrete conditions have become confused with that broader cultural kind of movement, which in itself may not necessarily have been a terrible thing. But I think as these things have come together, it's become much more problematic and difficult to handle.
Why is it problematic? Because we can't meet the need.
We can't meet the need. And I think, I talk about this in the book, I talk about this kind of distinction between the normal and the pathological.
Yeah.
And we used to have that distinction. And I think because we grew uncomfortable with the idea of saying that somebody was dysfunctional, it sounded bad, it sounded unkind. We've lost the language that allows us to make that kind of distinction. And I think we need to be able to do that because as a society, we need to be able to allocate resources to those that need them.
Yeah.
And we also need to be able to say to other people, you may have some difficulties, but to some extent, you need to be able to manage those difficulties.
Yeah.
And there's no, like I say, it's almost arbitrary, and there's no easy answer. But I do think we need to start having a conversation about what is it that society can afford. And I think we're seeing this in the welfare system as well. A lot of the welfare claims for benefits like personal independence payments, PIPs, and DLA, which is disability living allowance, they're the main disability allowances for children and adults. The claims that we're seeing are around the same sorts of conditions.
ADHD, autism, neurodiversity.
Yeah, and depression and anxiety too. And they're kind of driving the welfare bill as well. So you've got local authorities who are kind of struggling with the special educational needs bill, and you've got central government sort of struggling with the welfare bill. So we can't go on like this. We have to kind of come to some sort of settlement that we can agree on.
Well, we can't go on like this. What on earth would you do? I mean, do we redefine the lines? How do we define what normal is? How do we define what disordered is in whatever term it is? How do we find autism? Who decides? How do we stop?
I think the first thing we need to do is actually make the argument that it's legitimate to do that. Because I think there's a lot of people, a lot of influential people out there who will say you shouldn't be doing that. If people have needs, those needs must be met regardless. And that's unrealistic, but it's a very dominant view at the moment.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can do that. I think we need to kind of have a much more realistic conversation. So at the level, it's an intellectual exercise. It's an exercise of having those conversations with policymakers. It's about parents being encouraged to have more control, more responsibility, which is why I've had a problem with the social media ban, because it takes away responsibility.
You're not in favour of that, are you? Government is going to do a ban on social media for under 16s, just announced. But you don't think, even though there's so much harm associated with social media and children, you're not in favour?
I'm not. And, the claims around harm, there are all sorts of arguments for both sides of this, but I'm not persuaded that the risks that children face online outweigh the opportunities that children have. The educational opportunities even. I know from my own kids how much they get on YouTube and how useful that is in terms of them being able to access sources of knowledge which they wouldn't otherwise be able to access. And I think that's wonderful. I think it's a great thing that children have those things. And there's also the practical reality that most parents are unable to be over their children all the time. They need to have some sort of distraction often, because otherwise parents aren't able to work and raise them at the same time. And for right or wrong, a lot of parents find themselves in that situation where both of them are working, both of them are trying to look after their kids after they come home from school, perhaps working from home. And if they didn't have those devices, I'm not quite clear what else they do. Perhaps they go out and they do a good thing, but then you've got to deal with the problems that are out there as well. Because even though there's been a panic about it in the past, I think because adults have withdrawn, they have actually made some of the spaces around them potentially quite dangerous, because of their lack of authority and their lack of an ability to kind of step in when children are out of order. Sometimes that experience in a playground becomes more difficult and potentially quite dangerous. So I think, I think we have a role there to try and ensure that parents are given more autonomy and it's not taken away from them arbitrarily by a government that just seems to view parents as unable to raise their own children and unable to manage their usage of social media.
Yeah. So you're not giving parents the agency or the authority to look after their own children, which is in itself, as you're saying, bad for parents who that's what they need to be doing with children and with all of these. But I mean, do you think it's a sort of technological solution to a cultural problem, that the problem that children are facing now and the behavioural issues or the struggles are not down to smartphones, but they're down to this culture of lack of parental authority, lack of being able to take risks, lack of infrastructure outdoors?
Yes, I think so. I think there has been a tendency to blame the technology for a lot of the issues we face, when, as I say, sometimes it can be at least a part of the solution. I do think that, and I think, I argue there's two things going on. I think there's a cultural problem, which I've kind of already discussed in terms of the reasons why we're seeing this explosion of need and this labelling, kind of a contagion effect, where children are encouraged to kind of take on these identities. But at the same time, parents have stepped back and have, not just parents, adults in general, have stepped back and not use their authority to provide children with direction and boundaries and support and all the things they should do. So adults have stopped being adults, really. And
why? Why have adults stopped being adults? What's happened to them? Why are they affirming these need for identity? With the need to identify something became fashionable, and it unlocked resources or whatever, and it became cool, I suppose. But why are parents falling into it if they are?
I think the idea of authority has lost its currency. I think we feel uncomfortable using authority.
Why? What does that look like? That's not like smacking children and sending them to their room. What authority how would you describe it?
Well, authority of any kind, I think, has been problematized. I think adults are very uncomfortable with being adults. I'm always struck by looking back at my own parents and their parents and how they were naturally adults. They kind of fell into the role without any problem. Whereas I think now we tend to kind of feel like imposters. We're not quite sure what we're supposed to be doing necessarily. And we kind of make it up as we go along. And I suppose generations before have done that to some extent. But there's always been much more value attached to previous generations and I don't use the word skills because it's not just a skill, but their ability to raise children, their ability to impose their authority. I think we had a lot more respect for them than we do for adults now. And children pick up on that. Children, they see that parents and adults don't have that kind of status that they used to have. There isn't that distinction anymore. There isn't a hard distinction between being a child and being an adult. And a lot of the kind of cultural kind of cachet that came with that in the past has been delegitimized, I think. More conservative kind of ideas about what that role entails. And it's kind of being part of a family, being part of that kind of wider network of relationships. It's kind of all fallen apart to some extent. And I think without that legitimacy, adults really struggle and don't quite know how they're supposed to behave. So I kind of have some sympathy for parents, and this is something I feel myself as well, that we just need to kind of deal with that. We need to kind of re-establish our authority and start talking to each other about what it is we think is important and how we help children to flourish, how we protect them when we need to protect them, and where we lay down the line when we need to lay down the line, and how we provide them with a sense of purpose in life. And I don't think we're doing that at the moment, because I think we confuse ourselves. So I think a lot of these problems are to some extent down to that. They're down to that real struggle of adults to make sense of the world and make sense of themselves even.
So you're sort of suggesting that this crisis, which we can say it is not necessarily just about children, it's about adults. And we're less confident as adults, as parents and as teachers, I presume, and as a society. And why are we now afraid of authority, if that's what you're saying? You know, are we afraid of laying down boundaries, which we may have had more of back in, 30 years ago? Do we need adults who are prepared to say no more?
Yes, I think in the past we trusted folk knowledge, and we much more than we do now. Now we respect the expert, respect the institution, the law,
right.
the rules-based order, to coin a phrase. I think these are the things that have authority, not the informal mechanisms that we used to rely on, and which have much more kind of richness to them and much more value, I think. But we've lost them. We've they've been undermined and devalued. They're regarded as old-fashioned and in the past.
Yeah.
And sometimes we need those things. We need to be able to build on those things. We might discard some attitudes, but others we should be holding on to.
Yeah. No, I can think of many parents that will just refer their child to this expert or that expert or another expert that will give maybe a drug or maybe a set of things to do rather than learning about your child yourself and building your own handbook. Yeah. No,
and the great irony is that we have a problem whereby there aren't enough experts for all this need. And, you'll hear about a shortage of educational psychologists, a shortage of speech and language therapists and occupational therapists. But at the same time, you've got this kind of campaign to have a mental health practitioner in every classroom. Even though if your child has a special educational need or a condition like autism, you'll barely ever see a professional. The only time you'll see a professional is when they're assessed for an EHCP. Then you'll see a professional then. It might take a long time for you to see a professional, but you'll see them then. After that, once your need has been assessed, there's no support. The only reason you'll see a professional again is usually because you're getting medication and they have to give you the medication. Other than that, you won't get any therapeutic support. So there's a real kind of, on the one hand, there's this reliance on professionals. On the other, when we need them, we can't get them.
If you were Education Secretary tomorrow, what would be your first reform?
I always struggle with this because, as I argue in the book, most of the problems we're facing at the moment are cultural in nature. Having said that, there have been proposed reforms of the special educational needs system. So I think there are policy proposals which I would come up with in response to that, some of which I think I go along with some of the proposals that have been made. So the government, in an attempt to grapple with this exploding need in the special educational needs system, has tried to reduce the eligibility of parents for having an EHCP for their child.
They're going in earlier. They released something today, didn't they, where they're saying that they want to step in earlier and prevent children needing the special statements, as you call them. Is that right?
Yes, they say that, but it's interesting you mention that because I find that's not going to be helpful, because if you've already got an explosion of need, it might sound sensible in its own terms to identify need early, but if you're not meeting the needs that we've already identified, I'm not sure how identifying more need necessarily helps anybody. For each individual child, yes, my son, he was experiencing problems when he was in nursery, but it wasn't until later that he was assessed. And I think it would have been helpful if he was assessed earlier. Having said that, there's only so much need that can be met. And I think we have to kind of deal with that. So I think the government is attempting to grapple with that. The early intervention side of things isn't going to reduce the problem. I think, if anything, it's going to increase the volume of need that has to be dealt with. But in other ways, they're trying to restrict parents' rights, which I think overall isn't necessarily a good thing, because it creates this rights-based model, which just creates more need. So in as far as they're trying to arrest that problem, I kind of support that. But other than that, I think what's been proposed isn't helpful. So I've talked about the inclusion agenda and trying to get kids into one classroom rather than providing them with the provision they need. I think that's a big mistake. I think the government should be trying to meet children's needs, and if those needs happen to be specialist needs, and I think there will be a minority of children who do need that support, then they need to have the provision provided for them, which will be somewhere else. So I think they need to do that.
You're talking about a minority of children who need that support. You wouldn't dare put a figure on it. I know that it's a whole societal and cultural shift and a family shift, but we've got 1 in 5 children with a special education need. Would you even begin to say what you believe would be the proportion of children with a special educational need were we not given these perverse incentives to have a label?
It's very difficult to say, because the data in this area is very poor, because special educational needs are defined by the school.
So you just have no idea. You wouldn't say, it might be that it's bang on, it might be that it's way off. I mean, you wouldn't be able to say anything about that.
I think what I would do, and I would tentatively say that there are 3, maybe 4 broad groups within the special educational needs category. And I think we should be looking to treat those children differently. So you will have those children with a diagnosed need, and it's having an impact on their life and their ability to function. Those children with autism, in particular, there'll be other conditions, perhaps like Tourette's at its most extreme, who will have genuine needs that are very difficult and not easily dealt with in a mainstream school. And I think those needs need to be met. But you'll have other children with special educational needs who are probably far more numerous. And I think some of those will be children with behavioural problems. I think a lot of them will be children with behavioural problems, or what are sometimes dubbed conduct disorders. And a lot of children with ADHD have behaviour problems, and it may be that they're better dealt with in terms of the school working with the parents, between them finding a way of trying to address the behaviour itself.
You said tentatively 3, so we mentioned, I know that this is a very loose thing, autism, Tourette's. Would there be another need in there which you think absolutely would nearly always need the specialist support? The others are more nuanced.
Well, there are obviously those conditions which never get talked about, the learning disabilities and and physical disabilities, and there are children who don't get discussed at all in this discussion, and their needs are much more severe. So obviously they definitely need special provision. But they're a tiny proportion of this special educational needs group. And like I say, the majority of them will have either behaviour needs. Some of them perhaps. It's debatable whether it's helpful to describe it as a special educational need, because it's perhaps more to do with them falling behind to some extent, and they just need some more support. It's not a special educational need in the sense that it can be attributable to a condition or something external to the school. It's part of their education. It's something that's lacking in terms of an aspect of their learning, which the school is best placed to deal with, I think. You'll have other children with language needs. It may be the children who don't have English as a first language. I think some of that will be the case. So,
would you say there were some needs that we have this inclusion policy, and there are some things like some neurodiversities, attention deficit disorders, or dyspraxia, or whatever it is? Do you think there are some that should not require this extra specialist help, or do you think it's not possible to look at it that way?
I don't think you can look at it that way. I think the danger is that you end up excluding children who do need support from the system. I think the way to do it is to look at the impact it has on their ability to function on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's legitimate to say, even if they don't have a diagnosis, if a child is unable to function in a mainstream school and is very disruptive, then they need some other provision. And you'll find that children with autism, sometimes you'll have some children who are described as having mild autism, which is not a word I'd use, because I don't think any child with autism has mild autism. It's even if you've got a very able child who perhaps gifted, and a lot of children with Asperger's are very gifted, they still can be quite profoundly affected by their condition. They'll still have meltdowns. They'll still really struggle with their mental health, or there'll be associated problems they have. And so I think at one point it was suggested that some of these children wouldn't qualify for an EHCP or wouldn't be able to access special provision, but often they need it. So I don't think you can make that kind of hard judgment about if you have a particular condition, you do or don't qualify. I think it has to be about the impact it has on your ability to function.
So do we need to set up a kind of, we have in health, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, we have a body that looks at cost effectiveness of different interventions or different drugs or different devices. Do we need to set up a body to look at the cost effectiveness of what we're doing? Because as you say, it's unaffordable. How do we, I mean, you're saying it's very nuanced. You can't just throw some conditions out and put some in. You can't cherry pick this. So how do we sort it out? Apart from what you said, we need a conversation first, but given that we can have a conversation and that, you know, if we do have that conversation, how do we sort it out?
I think we can reduce the special educational needs budget by reviewing those needs,
But we could review them all over again and say, well, this person needs this much. They're still reviewing them on the same templates.
Yeah, so you have to change the system first. You can't have the same system in place.
But how would you, I'm not saying what would you do with that system, what template would you use? I'm saying what body do you think should be responsible for this? How would we do it? Would we have a specialist body to look at the whole system and review it? What would you do next?
I think you'd have to, there are several measures and there are several levels at which you'd have to do this. I think at a local level, and I think Reform have proposed something along these lines, schools need to tackle some of these issues. Schools themselves need to look at the children they have on their rolls. They need to look at the needs that they're facing. They need to look at what's causing those problems, and they need to address those problems in the most appropriate way, according to what their origin is. Is it to do with behaviour? Is it about education? Is it to do with a particular condition? I don't think there's any overarching solution or any overarching body that can deal with this problem, because, as I say, it is fundamentally a cultural problem. But I do think that the key principle is that we need to take a more pragmatic approach. We need to look at these needs again, and we need to do much better at grasping their origins. And for the most part, we need to empower teachers so that they're able to play a much more central role. And that initially that's going to need more resources. I think schools don't have the resources at the moment they need to address those needs. And the resources that have been put into the special educational needs system, perhaps it make more sense if schools themselves were able to access those resources and use them in a tailored way to meet the particular circumstances of the kids in those schools.
Yeah.
There are measures that can be introduced, perhaps at a government level, to restrict accessibility to some resources. But I'll be very, very kind of tentative about being too top down and being too definitive about which and can't qualify.
The government has some of the budget. But just sort of to round off now, it's been really fascinating. After everything you've learned, what do you think is the single most important thing that every parent should know or understand about raising children today? Do you think that we're getting so much wrong, but what do we need to think about?
I think parents need to learn to trust themselves more, which is hard to do today because we feel bombarded. And it's hard to argue that we need to even take control of their social media accounts because we feel we don't understand them. But I think we do need to kind of take a much more confident and much more emboldened view of ourselves and start not to assume that there's always someone else out there who has a better understanding of our children's needs. Because mostly solutions are going to be found somewhere between the parents, other adults in the community and the teacher. Yeah. And where there are issues for a minority of children, yes, experts need to be involved. And external support will be necessary. But for most of us, that is unlikely to be helpful. Yeah. It's going to send us down a cul-de-sac when we would be much better advised to try and take control of the situation for ourselves and help our kids to flourish. Yeah.
Yeah, beautifully said. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation and touching on some of the biggest questions facing children and parents and schools today. So the book, Crisis in the Classroom by Dave Clements, is published by Lua Press and available now. Thank you so much for listening and looking forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. If you'd like to hear more episodes, explore upcoming live events, or access free resources, you'll find all the links in the episode description. Just scroll down wherever you're listening.